Chris, you were saying you didn't have any ahas, but maybe you could think of just, since rubrics is something that we're fairly familiar with, maybe you have some ahas just about rubrics in general, or something like that.
Okay.
And so maybe we can start there, and then that gives us something to start our discussion on.
All right.
All right. So does anybody want to speak to their what they typed?
Well, I thought it was interesting. Tom, I think you typed rubrics for learning are much different than scoring rubrics.
Yes, that was me.
Can you tell me a little more about what you mean by that? How are they different?
Well, I think it might get to the difference between, let's say, an analytic rubric, which breaks the performance into its component parts, and then spells out what each of those criteria look like. So a student could, let's say, take my project, which is cite the main idea and support it. And they'd be able to see, oh, okay, that means I need to be able to find the main idea. I need to be able to find supporting evidence. I need to be able to explain that. And at this level, I'm doing it. It looks like this. At this level, it looks like that. Whereas a scoring rubric, I might just say, 5. Student is able to do these things, and then I would just be able to quickly say they're at this level.
Okay.
But that might not provide the same level of feedback to the student. So as I went along, and I read this Wiggins article today, I posted it in the group. That's what really made me think that I know less now than what I did before. And then part of that was mixing up scoring versus feedback to the student, and I keep finding myself going toward the scoring end of things as opposed to the feedback end of things, probably because of past practice.
So can I just say, so a scoring rubric would be more holistic and a feedback rubric would be more analytic?
I think so. What I'm starting to learn, it would be a general holistic rubric doesn't give as much information to students so that they can realize where they need to grow. And so that I guess maybe not in all cases, but in most cases that's not as helpful to them for learning. But it's very efficient for you and I to use to score very quickly because we're just looking for a holistic picture of where they at.
And so then the learning would occur as a result or in use of an analytic rubric.
Probably. I think what I'm learning, and I'm not, I don't want to sound like an expert, but what I'm learning is I think if there is a very simple one-dimensional kind of skill or performance that students are learning, then a holistic could provide that kind of level of detail. But I don't know that a lot of what we teach is that simple all the time. I think it tends to be like, especially when I looked at what you're doing, Sarah, I mean, it's like there's a lot involved in what you're teaching. So that's where I'm at. I'm discovering a ton of new things where I was telling Chris before you got into the room, if you'd have asked me before this whole thing started, I would have, which of these things are you confident that you know quite a bit about? Rubrics probably would have been at the top. And now I'd have to move it toward the bottom.
Interesting.
Yeah, I guess I hadn't really, Chris, I like your question. I was kind of looking at that same thing that Tom had typed in there and wondering what the difference was between those two.
Yeah, I just, it's interesting because when I think about rubrics, which is the comment I made, it sets the expectations for the students, and so they know what they need to do, and they get feedback on it. But I'm also using the same rubric to assess whether they've done what they're supposed to do. So I guess that's where, looking at Tom's comment, rubrics for learning are different than scoring rubrics, has me wondering what the difference is. So, sorry, just going to shut that off. There we go. Yeah. I don't need to know who that is.
So, Chris, do you think that your rubric could be used for both purposes? Could it be used for you to score and give information to the students?
That's how I've always used my rubrics. So I didn't even think that there was a different way. I mean, I'll give the student the assignment where I explain the assignment and it has the guidelines in it, but then that's also reflected more specifically in the rubric. So, I don't know.
Yeah, and I don't know that I was saying that there would be two different rubrics.
Right.
But I don't know that my scoring rubrics have always been real helpful to students. Maybe that's what I meant to say is if I'm going to develop a rubric, it should be more on the end of giving students meaningful information to learn as opposed to something that makes it easy for me to score their work.
Okay.
So maybe that's what I was getting at. Anything else pop out that looks...
Well, I was going to ask Sarah, with the IB rubrics, I'm not. How are those different? You know what I mean? I mean, I would love to hear more about that.
So what IB does is that they give specific rubrics that you use in your classes, and the rubrics are skill-based instead of like assignment-based. And then what I do in my classroom is make like a task-specific portion of that rubric that will go along with the specific assignment. So say the skill is communication or data processing, it will say, if it's data processing, it will say, okay, they can make a data table. And so I would then lay out the specifics of like, okay, you should collect this much data. You should have it in a chart in Excel. You should like give them the details on that. So the bigger skills that the students have are all the same, and then like throughout all the IB schools, and then the specific assignment that I choose to give on that is
what choice. You tailor. Okay. Interesting.
But it's hard. I mean, it's hard to describe that. But I really like the words or the labels that we were given for these here to be able to explain that practice.
Cool.
All right. So who is the one who put in rubrics are really hard to create if the teacher doesn't know the standard or the objective?
That would be me.
So can you speak a little bit to that, Chris?
Absolutely. One of the things that we always talk about starting with the end in mind. What do we want the kids, where do we want them to end up? What do they have to do at the end of the unit? But if we don't understand the beginning, if we don't understand the objective, the standard, that whole piece we did with the learning progressions, if we don't get that, then you can't create an effective rubric because you have no idea what you're assessing. And if you don't know what you're assessing, you have no idea how to explain to the kids what it is they need to do. So They are hard to create and challenging, depending on the level of specificity you get with the rubric, and when you have to start, taking into account redos, retakes, standards-based grading, all of that, plus making sure that students understand what's happening. The teacher, again, needs to know and understand that basic standard or objective.
So a question, you were speaking about we. Do you usually create this kind of a rubric with a team or with a colleague?
Actually, we kind of create the product or the project or the idea, and then I come up with the rubric, and everybody else uses it.
Oh, okay.
So,
okay.
But
how does that process work for you? Would you like a different process, or does that seem to work okay for you?
It works fine for me because I get to use other people's brains to come up with the whole general idea of what the students are going to do, and we have a shared understanding of what the standard or objective is, and then the sequential side of my brain that I don't use very often likes to really work with making those rubrics. So
I'm gonna let my dog out. Somebody locked my dog in the room here. I'll be right back.
So Sarah, do you have for the IB rubrics across Park Center's the only IB
senior high.
10, 12, senior high. Okay. Yep. So are the rubrics that you use, are there generic ones that you can then tweak 7, 12 so you can,
Yeah, so it is generic 7, 12 or 7, 10 or whatever.
Okay.
And then we just kind of modify them along the way, and that's part of the process. Is the work you get from a 7th grader obviously doesn't look like the same product from a junior or senior.
Right. Yeah, and we did that in English Language Arts 7, 12 with our priority standards. So we already have the rubrics done, and then we can tailor them to the particular assignment. So I was just curious if you had that same resource with the IB.
It's so helpful
across the district.
And it would maybe be helpful as we go through our Hangout today that the two of you can kind of comment on how the process that was outlined in this module either diverges or converges with the IB process or the priority standard process. It'd be interesting to see if there's commonalities or if there were some conflicts in the way these things worked. So, all right, that's great. Let's look at having some fun. We have a couple rubrics here. The example rubric was the one I did, and I'd prefer not to look at that since you guys are, because you're here, and I'd like you to be, having time to talk and look at things. So we have Sarah, Chris. There was a practice one here in case we wanted to do something like that. That doesn't have to be done, but I had Sarah's in there first. So Sarah, I think I'm going to open yours up.
Great.
So I figured, rather than cut and paste, why don't we just
go to the document.
Exactly. It's a lot easier. And I'll scroll down to the
rubric at the bottom. Okay, great.
And so if you want to, Sarah, just kind of, I don't know, if you want to maybe call out maybe the process, you could point us to things that maybe you'd like to discuss and get input on, maybe some things that help us understand the type of rubric it is.
Yeah.
And I can scroll as you go through. You can give me directions like Tom, move down or whatever.
Sounds good. I will do that.
Okay. All right.
So in here, this is one of our IB rubrics. One of the things that we're focusing on this year a lot is communication in science. And the authentic assessment that I have my students doing here is designing a prototype of an object to protect a device that they have, some sort of electronic device, and then they would be writing up how that would work or giving a presentation on how that would work. So I figured the communication rubric would be the most appropriate one here. And in the very first column, it gives a task grade, so that would be the score that it would get. And in the middle column, it has this is the IB portion, or what IB tells us, so including the scientific language and using effective communication. And then in the far right side, this is the task descriptors, or the part that I've been modifying. And as part of our data team this year, we came up with kind of this checklist. That's the part that's highlighted in yellow, where it says communication is, and then it gives a list of descriptors. Because we're not English teachers and because we're physics teachers, this was the best of what we could come up with of what effective communication looked like. And so this is what we give our students right here. And we don't just give them this. Then we give them this, and then we practice this, and we look at examples to make sure that that they understand what those things mean, or what we're meaning when we say that. And above that, the two parts in the task descriptors that are not highlighted, I kind of made specific to this part of the rubric, so that they would correctly explain the physics, and then they would effectively explain the prototype, and then giving some examples of, they would include a detailed and correct motion map and a force diagram, which is something that we've been working on in class.
Okay. So the task descriptors are really
this is the part
explain in more detail what
Yep,
that
what
four
you would
score
need to do.
what sufficient looks like, and what effective communications. Okay. Okay.
And then at the very bottom of this part, so underneath the score of the 1 and 0, if you want to scroll down, Tom,
Okay.
put in the words for what explain means, what describe means, and what state means, because those are the 3 different levels there. So,
Okay.
and those are words that we consistently use. Those are IB, have specific IB definitions that the students see in all their classes then. So.
Okay.
Interesting. So then, do you do, because one of the things that we've talked about is the halves, or the 0.3s, the decimals versus whole versus. So do you have a provision in here for what if a student, you want to give a kid a 3.5? What does that look like?
That's a great question. What we've done at this point is we've only given out whole numbers.
Okay.
Based off this rubric, I feel like it's really easy for me to judge the difference between an A and a B, but it's not easy for me to judge in between there.
Okay.
So that is something that we've decided, and then we've come to so for the issue with that is that then maybe the grade isn't as high as the student would like, or as detailed as the student would like. Of course, there's the redo and retake policy, and my students are welcome to redo any of the assignments that they have in class. So if they feel like a 3 is not accurate, then that's perfectly fine. You can go ahead and try it again and get a 4. So
okay,
that's kind of my back and forth on that.
Okay.
So I realized I had Chris on there the whole time, which is fine, because Chris is such a wonderful person to look at.
Well, actually, I was looking at Sarah, so because I still don't see Sarah at the bottom of the screen, so it was nice to be able to.
That's really strange. That is very strange.
Absolutely no icon. It shows that she's there, but there is no.
But just no
visual. So it's interesting. So here's a question. I was just gonna.
No. As I say, I was scrolling all over the document, but it was never being broadcast on the front page. So
that's okay. Again, I have it open on the other side. But can you see me by any chance?
I can.
On the bottom.
You can. Do you see you on the bottom?
Yep.
Okay. Because what happened when I was using Google Chrome for a Hangout is I couldn't see me at the bottom.
Oh, weird.
So I just wondered if but I'm in Firefox for the Hangout. So anyway. It's strange. Weird. It is very strange. Okay.
So, Chris, do you have any other kinds of things you want to bring up on Sarah's rubric that you notice, or questions you have?
Well, I'm looking at the language between the. All right. So for a 4, correctly explains physics, effectively explains prototype. And so I see. So 4 is explains, 3 is describes. How do you clarify for the students the difference between an explanation versus a description?
So at the very bottom, it's got those definitions down there.
Okay, so causes, reasons, mechanisms.
Yes.
Okay.
versus just a detailed account.
Okay. And is this written communication verbal? Well, it says here written, but could it be done verbally?
Yes. I use this rubric for either.
Okay.
Or for both. I use it in both cases.
Okay.
And now, Sarah, is there like exemplars that go along with this, so I could see if I were a student, and let's say the feedback to me is you're describing, you're not explaining, I can see a difference in that?
Yeah, a lot of times we will, in the learning process, as we're using the rubric, we'll either have the students generate examples, or like we'll do some sort of scaffolding activity where they build part of it or something like that, or different groups build parts of it. And then we'll look at that and we'll kind of go through those different parts together, and we'll say, okay, what is this doing? Is this explaining? Is this describing? Is this stating? What would we do if we need to move it up? What is it that makes it this different from this? So it's not necessarily exemplars that I've always generated, but I feel like kind of that learning process is part of having them try it and then us critique that together and see what we could change on that together.
Okay.
And you said that as part of IB language, explain, describe, and state are terms that all students hear in all classes, correct?
Yep.
So I think that's intriguing, because in English, explain, describe, state, theme could be done differently.
Yep.
Interesting. Very interesting. I think the more common language the students have, the better off they are.
It's really helpful. Yeah, definitely.
Sarah, you were saying that you had a harder time determining between a 2 and a 3. Can you talk to why that is more difficult? Is it, for instance, is it because of the way the rubric's constructed that makes it more difficult?
Maybe I misspoke. No, I feel like it's easy for me to determine in between individual grade bands. So it's easy for me to tell this is a C, this is a B, this is an A. But it's harder to tell, like, this is an A, this is an A minus, or this is, like a B plus, or it's too fine-tuned because this whole rubric is much more holistic, I think.
Okay.
And it's also very specific. You know what I mean? I suppose you could, if you really wanted to, give them a 3.5 if they correctly describe the first one but effectively explain the second one.
Right, if it was in between
so, but that would be splitting some hairs, I suppose.
Yeah, so it's hard to keep consistency if it's too detailed in that way.
It's kind of interesting because even in our discussion that we're having now, we're really deferring to the scoring discussion, as opposed to the learning discussion, and that goes back to where I'll get into a rubric and all of a sudden I'm like, wait a minute, I'm thinking only in terms of how will I use this to assign a grade, as opposed to how can I make this helpful for a student. And that's why this has been difficult for me, because I have been poorly trained for all my years of using rubrics. So you find this this is an effective way of helping students with their learning. Primarily, why? What makes this an effective rubric for learning?
So I feel like the consistency, I feel like, is helpful. This rubric we use all year long. The communication rubric we use all year long. The details on the side might change of, in this situation, this is how you would communicate effectively. It looks different if you're creating a PowerPoint than if you're writing a lab report or something like that. But that still, there's these similar things that you need to do. You need to be explaining or describing or state, like these higher order thinking skills are still things that you need to be doing to be achieving at the highest levels. And so I think that part is helpful, that helping them really practice these skills of being a scientist is helpful and for their learning. And then I also think that the practice that we do, I never just give them the rubric and say ready, set, go. there's some sort of activities or some sort of scaffolding along the way to get them to be able to successfully complete the assignment.
So they're using the rubric frequently from the beginning of the instruction all the way to the end. Then.
The whole year.
So something you said was, which I found very interesting, is if I look at your rubric, then the communication and science, that middle band, that's going to stay consistent, maybe for a variety of assignments. And then it's the task descriptors. That's where it would change based on, like you were saying. Okay. So so they're used to seeing, oh, communication and science. In this task, this is kind of what it looks like then.
Yep.
Okay. All right.
What does sufficient mean when you're looking at this rubric? If I was a parent and my kid brings this home, I kind of can figure out, okay, some limited. What is sufficient?
Yep. I think that's one part that's hard. The use of that word that they picked in there. So usually, well, I guess it depends on the context again.
Okay.
But if it's like just like a short essay or short like non-fiction writing assignment that I give my students, then we would talk about like, okay, here's your list of vocabulary words. Sufficient in this case would mean that you're using this number or this percent, or that I'm seeing a majority of these words in there.
Okay.
So in this case, I think sufficient and the explain go together, because they're going to have to be using the science vocabulary in order to talk about the causes and the reasons.
Okay.
In that case. So.
And then did you cross out the fully documents, the sources, because it's a different rubric, right?
Well, yeah, because in this case, the information would be coming strictly from them, so this wouldn't be an appropriate place where they need to cite outside sources.
Gotcha.
So,
okay.
Again, because I'm using it in different contexts, sometimes it is appropriate and sometimes it isn't.
Okay.
Yeah, Sarah, what you just explained resonates in something that I had read from the Wiggins article. He's very critical of rubrics that use comparative language, specifically like better, worse. And he says how a rubric should provide clear and precise description of the unique features of performance at each level. And I think that's what you're getting at in those task descriptors. So like Chris said, what is sufficient? Well, okay, sufficient in this case means you are correctly explaining physics. And okay, now I have a picture of sufficient, and if you would then have exemplars of that, I can see where students can definitely know where they're at and where they want to go, and then of course the instruction how to get there.
Hopefully that's the goal, right?